Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Bianca, and I am a third-year Peace and Conflict Studies student in the PPR department here at Lancaster. And so my research and my degree is primarily concerned with the ways in which we conceive of conflict and also the ways in which we deal with them. And I think it's fair to say that conflict and war have garnered more attention than any other aspect of international relations, of all time. And for all that time and effort and research, the way in which we approach conflict and the way in which we deal with it has remained relatively unchanged for the better part of a millennium. And now, as we find ourselves in a deeply confusing and deeply polarized 21st century, it's about time something changed. But before we can go forward, we must look back, and so I'm going to take some time to look at what conflict resolution looks like today. We all have this vision in our heads of what negotiations and diplomacy look like, right? So it's two or more heads of state going into a room with their groups of advisors. They have translators in their ears, probably it's a big building like the UN. And they're desperately trying to reach a compromise without giving away too much of their national interest. And that picture isn't too far from the truth. And that's because that's built on a very specific model in international relations, where we think of the world as being composed mainly of nation states. They're the main actors in the international system, and they're all engaged in a zero-sum game for power. And because they need to play this game, they have some tools. The traditional tools of diplomacy are ones that are easily identifiable in the news today if you look for them. Threats of armed force can be clearly seen in the NATO alliance, nuclear deterrence, and so on. Economic sanctions can be exemplified by the trade war between China and the United States. And there's obviously deploying of soft power, which involves the strategic use of aid and use of influence in international organizations, such as influence within the United Nations and so on. The problem with these tools and the framework that they belong to is that they're very dependent on linear lines of causality, and because of that, they produce band-aid solutions to conflicts. They don't look at the overarching reasons for conflict, rather they look at the symptoms. And because of that, we find ourselves dealing with overly protracted conflicts that have come to define the century, like the Syrian Civil War. More important than that, however, is that conflict itself has fundamentally shifted. Because of an increased access to technology and increased interconnectedness, there are more arenas for conflict and tension now than ever before in history. We have cyber warfare, drone warfare, new terror organizations every day, it would seem. And because of that, defense ministries across the world are having to contend with this concept known as the gray zone, a zone of total ambiguity between total war and total peace, where literally anything can happen. And as a person working in the defense ministry, that's scary. How do you deal with that level of unpredictability in the face of policymakers who call for nothing but order and stability? My solution, or well, the solution I think will work anyway, is complex systems theory. Complex systems theory, or complexity theory, refers to a series of tools and concepts taken from the natural sciences and transplanted into the policy world in the 1960s. Complex systems theory has one main shift in paradigm that changes the way we look at conflict. It essentially thinks of the international system as a living organism. And so the parts within it interact like organs within a body or atoms in a colony. And tracking those interactions gives us greater insight into why conflict takes place and how best to resolve it. And that changes the main assumptions that we have about it. So how does it differ from the current system? Well, to begin, it contends that tensions within the system are viewed as not only inevitable, but necessary. Tensions within complexity theory are a sign of life. And so to attempt to create a system with no tensions would mean to attempt to create a dead system. The other main difference is that these tensions and the ways in which they manifest, such as conflict, in a complex system are viewed as inherently unpredictable. And instead of trying to push an order of predictability onto them, you instead try to adapt. And so complexity theory, like diplomacy, comes with its own set of tools. So these are the tools of complexity that I've chosen to focus on. There are so many more, but for the purpose of today, we'll talk about these three. Amplification. Amplification is attempting to understand the snowball or ripple effects from major events, and also recognizing these ripple effects may in themselves become great events. Understanding this and adapting that into resolution policy makes sure that we cover all our bases. Agent-based modeling is attempting to simulate the interactions between potential actors and provides the organizations that are making those decisions the capability to understand potential situations and also potential areas for adaptation. Finally, organizing chaos is using organizational matrices such as the Stacey diagram, which is that graph thing there, to make sense of chaotic concepts such as the gray zone by creating a map to understand the chaos. These, in my mind, give complexity some distinct advantages above the current mode of understanding conflict. First, it doesn't throw away the current system. Complexity makes use of the current system while still encouraging an attitude of holistic approaches. It encourages people to think about the context of the conflict, not just the conflict itself. Second, and probably the most important advantage in my mind, is that it allows our governing bodies to better prepare themselves for unpredictability, because we all want governing bodies that are adaptable and resilient as opposed to scared of change. And finally, conflict resolution today contains such nebulous concepts such as conflict transformation and structural prevention that have potential but don't necessarily have structure. And complexity gives us a potential framework to bring out that potential. Now that is a lot of information, but what am I doing with it? So I have a distinct lack of access to active war zones, which I'm very grateful for. But that means I've had to situate my work in a case study. And so I've chosen to work with the India-Pakistan conflict, not only because it is one of the most important protracted conflicts of our time and has far-reaching consequences today, but it is very well documented in terms of the way it's been sort of dealt with. But how do you go back in time and apply a logic that you've sort of come up with today? So score one for interdisciplinary work, because I stole it out of a colleague from the law school. This book, Feminist Judgments from Theory to Practice, was written by a bunch of female lawyers who went back to the 20th century, well not literally, but they went back and looked at judgments from key cases in English law in the 20th century and retroactively applied feminist theory to them and sort of worked on the difference in judgments that would take place. And I'm still 2 months away from my dissertation deadline, so I'm still currently in the process of adapting that methodology, but early work suggests that there is a really positive space for complexity to grow within conflict. Ultimately, for me, complexity represents a new pathway within conflict resolution. It's a new frontier, and I know that sounds very cheesy, but it is a new pathway that allows us not to be bogged down by unpredictability, but to accept it and utilize it and channel it in a way that will hopefully benefit our future generations. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Bianca. So do you have any questions from the audience?
You say that it's a more sort of holistic way of looking at conflicts in general. Where do you think that leaves the traditional tools for resolving conflict, the sort of the idea of deterrence and the idea of the economic sanctions? How much of a place do they still have there?
I think they will absolutely still have a place. That was one of the points I got up, is that it doesn't throw away these tools. It just makes economic sanctions more effective. So, taking the example of economic sanctions, if you looked at it from a more like holistic standpoint, you would make sure that your economic sanctions don't affect the civilian populations of the country that you're targeting, rather they would target the government structures that you are coming up against. And so I think that context adds strength to the existing structure. Hope that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
exactly.
So,
So I just think that, do you think it's more passive or active? So are we just understanding what is happening in the world and then applying it, or are we trying to actively influence these varieties of change?
Okay. Currently it's very passive. There are like very few people working in this field, and complexity theory, although it makes sense to me, is still very fringe in a way, but hopefully working on this research and having my colleagues in the field working with research, it will become an active part of decision making. Because ultimately, I think that's the goal for all of us, to have decision making that is more respectful of the context of the real world.
Yes, nice.
Am I right in understanding that employing this complex theory targets it more towards the governments that are involved in the conflicts rather than just this country and that country?
I think, yeah, so it involves the governments, but it also involves all of the actors that are currently not being accounted for. So it accounts for all of the organizations within that system. It accounts for the populations as being like separate from the government, so they have different interests. It essentially takes, or tries to take into account, every single person as far as possible, so that when the solution comes out, it's good for every single person and not a particular interest group. Yes. No, I don't know. I can't say yes. She can say yes.
So you said this was originally developed in the 60s.
Yeah.
Has there been much change from what it originally was to sort of what it is now?
So initially it came into the field of international relations as sort of going off the back of this idea of pragmatism within the international system, and it was mainly used in the policy world. Like I said, it is a very fringe sort of theory, so there hasn't been a massive amount of work on it. But the work on it that has been done has pushed it forward, in that there were issues to begin with, issues with transplanting what is essentially a natural science into the social sciences. But because people have worked on it progressively and steadily, not that much engagement, but steady engagement, it's sort of making that transformation over time into adapting into social science. And I think that's been the fundamental change over time.
I know you said that this was based on, or you were using kind of the methodology of the lawyers.
Yes.
I wondered what you found most interesting from that and what you kind of have taken from that.
So the most interesting thing that I found from that book in particular and their methodology was that they weren't looking at the cases themselves, they were more actively searching for gaps in knowledge, and I think that's the most useful thing I found when going back to my work and looking at transcripts of like conflict resolution and stuff. I wasn't looking at the work they were doing, I was looking for gaps in their information and seeing if those gaps could effectively be filled with complexity. And that was probably the most interesting thing, I thought anyway.
We're running quite early, so please just ask any questions you have.
Any questions?
Even if it's just about generically about research or...
Oh, God.
The last slide had a book about feminist theory applied to judgment. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, I could go back to it.
That's the one.
Yeah.
So you briefly described the basic and feminist theory approach to previous cases from the past.
English law, yeah.
So I don't quite understand what that means in practice.
Okay.
Like, well, I don't, yeah.
No,
explain.
so essentially what they did was they took sort of news coverage, legal transcripts, and all of the information they could get about these particular cases. They looked at the judgments and they looked at what they believed informed those judgments, and then they tried to supplement that with feminist theory and imagined essentially what if the judge was a woman who subscribed to feminist theories, what would the judgment have been, how would it have changed, and consequently how would the landscape of law have changed. And that's essentially what they did, and I found it really useful because that's essentially what I'm trying to do, but with international relations.
Can you sort of give an example? I don't know if they're short enough.
I really can't. They're
Okay,
really
sorry.
long. Book. I'm really sorry, but like, yeah, I'm really
Yeah,
can't. I'm really sorry.
So did the cases in this book, were they just on, for example, like issues of gender equality, or were they on everything?
They were on everything, from civil liberties to childcare to issues of gender. But that's what I was going for anyway. But it was just a bit of everything, and just understanding that feminist theory can permeate into every part of life, essentially. Yeah.
Do you think this highlights the importance of interdisciplinary work, or do you think that it's made it very difficult to translate something from a natural science to a social science?
No, I think for me in particular, it really opened my eyes up to the benefits of talking to people from other disciplines. Like, I obviously couldn't have done my case study if I didn't talk to someone in the law school. I wouldn't be doing this dissertation if I hadn't talked to people doing it in other fields of international relations. And so I think that, obviously I think I'm a big fan of complexity theory. So I obviously think there's huge merit to bridging that gap between science and the humanities. Although the